Welcome to the Mind and Crip Theology podcast, hosted by Miriam Peace and Amy Patton, which come out of the Canadian Journal of Theology, Mental Health, and Disability.
We both live and work on lands that have been homes and remain homes to the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Neutral, and the Ojibwe Chippewa peoples and other peoples who have cared for the land.
We are grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land and are mindful of the need to repair broken covenants.
This podcast is an opportunity to model how faith communities can engage in theological and spiritual conversations around madness and cripness.
If you need a full transcript, you can find our videos on our YouTube channel.
We want to say before we begin that topics and conversations we are raising throughout our time together are often hard.
They are hard for mad and crip people ourselves, and hard for our families and loved ones.
So do what you need to do to take care of yourselves, your bodies, minds, and hearts.
And now, here is our episode.
Yeah.
Well, hi, it's so great to be here this afternoon with all of us. Um, and we just wanted to, Miriam and I wanted to start a podcast just to sort of um, do something fun with the Canadian Journal of Theology, Mental Health, and Disability, which we've just launched. Our first issue came out last month in April, so we're really excited. And what we wanted to do is have podcasts to accompany each issue that would allow us to dive a little bit deeper into the pieces that we have included. So, so it's technically our second podcast today. So we're super excited for that. And what we are hoping to do is ask both of you to introduce yourselves. So Miriam's just going to put in the chat the things we're hoping that you could mention, just your name and your pronouns, your work or your academic location, wherever you are right now in life, and then maybe say something a bit about your connection to mental health and disability, and how you found the journal or how we found you. Yeah, so we just want to invite you just to relax this afternoon. Hopefully you've got a coffee with you or some sort of tea, and we'll just chat for an hour. So, Jasper, I'm going to invite you to introduce yourself first.
Sure, okay. So my name is Jasper. I also go by Jay. My pronouns are he, him. I'm currently doing a master's of spiritual care at Emmanuel College at University of Toronto, and I'm also training at the Create Institute for Expressive Arts Therapy. In terms of my connection to mental health, I have lived experience of mental health difficulties and also invisible disability. I identify as mad, queer, neurodivergent, and trans. So the intersections of mental health, theology, social justice, and community are really a passion of mine.
Thanks, Jasper. And so and now Jasmine.
Hi, I'm Jasmine Duckworth. My pronouns are she, her. I work for Christian Horizons, which is an organization that provides services for people with developmental disabilities. And I've been working in the field of disability for about 17 years. I heard about the journal through one of my colleagues there at work, Dr. Keith Dow. He mentioned it to me. So that's partly my connection to disability as my professional one, but also personally, I have a neuromuscular disease called myasthenia gravis, which affects most of the muscles in my body, and so it affects a lot of my mobility and just the way I do things. And that has been about 6 years that I've had that, and I've identified as disabled.
Thank you so much for sharing a bit about yourself. I think it's important for readers and viewers to know not just your pieces, but the you behind your pieces. So that's why we're having these conversations. At first, our first question is kind of beyond your pieces, and then we'll move into talking specifically about your work. Um, and as a request, Jasper, I wonder if you could have an image ready to share later. So the first question is, how is your work going with the communities you're serving or you're located right now? What needs are you seeing rising because of COVID or staying consistent? And how do you understand this, these needs and this work through a theological or spiritual lens? So, really easy questions, no pressure. But I wonder if Jasmine could start us off.
Sure. So my role at Christian Horizons is a community development manager, which means that I'm supposed to connect the work that we do with the broader community. And I do a lot of work with the Christian community because we are a faith-based agency. We have a good connection there. My work has really changed over the pandemic because I used to run lunch and learns and speak at conferences and go to churches and do trainings with volunteers, and can't do most of that. But the beautiful thing is that it gave me a lot more time and motivation to work on community building within Christian Horizons. So throughout the pandemic, I've been meeting with some of the people that use our services on regular Zoom calls or video calls. So there's a couple groups of self-advocates that have been coming together to work on how to advocate for disability issues in Christian Horizons and in the broader community, also educating themselves on issues so that they are better able to advocate, and just supporting each other in that journey. Also, I've been in some weekly calls where we just get together for fun. So we play games and we talk, and it's been really, really lovely to get to have more contact with the people that use our services, because since I stopped working in direct care, I've lost some of that connection. So that's been neat. But the needs that I see arising, continuing, it's similar to always. A lot of the people that live in group homes or in other congregate care settings, even living supported independent living, they're often isolated. They often have smaller social circles than the average person. And that has only intensified because of COVID, because they have staff coming in to provide their personal care needs or other support needs. It makes them more vulnerable. And so they need to take more precautions than the average citizen, which increases the isolation that was maybe already there. So that's been a real need. But the kind of the spiritual or theological way that I see that playing out, it's connected to my article where I talked about shifting the margins. And when Jesus goes to the margins, then he shifts the margins, and the people group he's with are no longer on the edges. He's now in the center. They are centered, and they are where it's at. And I'm seeing that because the whole world has shifted from where we used to gather. We're all in our homes now. The people that use Christian Horizon services that are living, and people with other disabilities and vulnerabilities, are in their own homes, but so many things have come into our homes, and our homes are not so much on the margins. I used to, personally, with my disability and vulnerabilities, I used to feel kind of on the edge when it was cold and flu season, because I had to like shield a bit from people who were sick. Whereas, and like, it used to be hard for me to do some things like go to church or go to certain spaces. I don't have to do those now. They come into my living room. They come into my phone in my hand. And so community begins at home. At work, we talk a lot about nurturing communities of belonging, and the focus has always been getting out into community. But now we see the margins shifting and community is coming in. So it's been really neat to see how that has happened.
Well, thanks so much, Chibo. Sorry, I just got so enraptured with my note taking. It's the academic in me, I think. um,
and that's
oh yes,
sorry, my bad. So I got
we're both.
kind of, we both got kind of in what Jasmine had to say.
Yes,
So
it's so true.
let's get caught up in Jasper.
Yes.
That's totally fine. Jasmine, I love that idea of moving the margins. I just find it so powerful. So, my work, I work largely in the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. I do kind of a little bit of this and that. I work at a mental health organization, running a pilot project for queer youth. It's a series of workshops around mental health and community building, and it's all online. And then I also co-facilitate a arts therapy group for bi people, and we're actually currently the only therapy group running specific for bisexual and pansexual people in Toronto, and that's also online. So in a lot of ways, strangely, I've felt more connected with community during COVID because for me, with my mental health, and then also being trans and all of these other barriers, it's kind of difficult to go out in the world. So being able to be involved in community through the internet has been a really unique experience. And I found that too with a lot of the people who are in the groups that I'm facilitating. They live in rural areas. Sometimes they don't have access to a lot of queer specific community or services, so that's been really great for accessibility. And then of course, folks with disabilities who might not be able to get to physical spaces. But then there's also the drawbacks where, if somebody isn't out, it's difficult to find a private space to connect through the internet. I was working at a seniors group for LGBT seniors, and that was definitely a barrier for them accessing, the technology. So I think it's totally changed a lot of the ways we think about community, I think, and gathering and accessibility. And in terms of theology, I think a lot of 2S LGBTQ people, I think, are really looking for some kind of faith community, whether they come from a faith tradition or a faith community that has ostracized them because of, I would argue, misinterpretation of scripture, and using that rhetoric to justify hate, and not being able to access queer positive faith communities. But I find that a lot of folks that I've met really have kind of a queer theology, and that they'll maintain certain parts of their faith tradition, and find these queer positive faith spaces, and then also kind of find new theologies and new spiritual practices to incorporate in it too. And I think during COVID, people have been seeking those sources of meaning, and in a way, I think the internet can provide that access to different types of faith practices and kind of reconceptualizing, I guess, faith community. Yeah.
Well, thanks to you both. It's so interesting to hear what you're both up to. So we wanted to ask Jasper. So Jasper, your piece that we published in this issue, it incorporated some research that you had done and also some of your paintings that you had done. So we wanted to ask you to show either one of the paintings from the paper or something else that you wanted to highlight today for our viewers. And I hope you could also describe it, because we're also going to be making this into a podcast, and then you could talk about your work. We're really excited to see.
Oh, I would be honored. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I think you have the power to share your screen. You should.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, I think I'm gonna pick. Oh, actually, sorry, that's the wrong one. Sorry, 1 second.
Oh, it's okay.
I don't know why it's showing this one. It's funny, I've done this so many times, and every time it.
I know, and then you're in a group.
I know.
We can edit things out.
That would be great. So I'm showing this one. This is one of the ones that goes along with the piece. Should I talk a bit about the process of writing this piece as well, and what the paintings have to do with it?
That would be great. Yes, please.
Sure, yeah. So for this piece, I used an arts-based research method. So I noticed that a lot of people in my community identify as a queer witch. I don't know if it's just the type of people that I hang around, or if it's a larger movement, which I actually discovered later reading the literature. But I decided it could be interesting to just have a conversation with some of these folks who identify as queer witches. So I called them on Zoom, and they answered some questions for me and spoke a bit about their relationship to queerness and their worldview. And so based on that, I made different paintings, kind of digital drawing and collage of each of the people that I had the privilege to speak with based on our conversation. So this particular piece is of Talon, who is a friend of mine and just an incredibly amazing person. They came out with a book on magic studies, and they're about to come up with a second one, I believe. So this painting shows them with kind of a bunch of rainbow colors. You can see some almost psychedelic looking mushrooms. There's some collage of Alice in Wonderland, and the Willy Wonka golden ticket, and then some lotuses and a necklace of the Star of David. And they have long flowing hair, very colorful, and then lips painted like the Cheshire cat. And essentially for this, I incorporated a lot of what we spoke about, which is they identify as pagan, Buddhist, and Jewish. So they draw from all of those traditions, which I found really interesting. And it was really cool seeing the intersections of that as well, and how their spiritual practices and ritual really embody all of those traditions, and then related to queer culture and pop culture, the Alice in Wonderland component, and the Willy Wonka component, just this whimsical incorporation of like, things I think that a lot of people wouldn't consider serious theology. Whereas I think the cool thing about Talon and about a lot of queer folks is that they incorporate a lot of different things into their spiritual practice, from a lot of different places. So that's one of the pieces that I made for this.
Thank you so much, Jasper. I think Miriam might ask you a question now.
Sure.
So I wonder if you can talk a bit about your piece, especially how you use this idea of magic in relation to suffering and hope.
Okay. Should I keep the picture up, or am I
You can take it down.
okay?
It's a beautiful picture.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So just to clarify, are you wanting to hear about my personal kind of experience and practices, or just in general about the piece?
About it, I mean, whatever you feel comfortable, but
Oh, sure.
I was thinking more about the piece and how that ties into your artwork.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I really love queer theory. And in my piece, I talk a lot about queer utopia, which is an idea in a book by Jose Munoz. And one thing in particular that he spoke about that resonates with me is this idea of astonishment. And he says, astonishment helps one surpass the limitations of an alienating presentness and allows one to see different time and place. So for me, whether you call it magic or sacredness, art, post-traumatic growth, I think this essence of astonishment is present in all of that, and the ability to see a then and there beyond the here and now. And I believe that that's at the heart of community building and justice work too. So for me, all of these things in my life are inseparable from spiritual practice, whether it's the everyday rituals that I do. For example, I will light a candle and pull a tarot card before I go to sleep at night, just to kind of honor my ancestors and the indigenous peoples of this land and the land. And I'll do kind of various rituals throughout the day with that. And I see my art as a huge source of connecting to the sacred, because it has that ritual element, and it's also connecting to this sense of astonishment, or this sense of being part of something larger than ourselves that we can't quite explain, and that I think we, or at least I, don't really want to, because it's wonder and awe. And I think that sense of hope is kind of what drives my own spiritual practice, and probably, I believe, a lot of other people's as well. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but
Thank you so much, Jasper. It certainly does. And yeah, there's a lot more to dig into. But for now, I want to turn to Jasmine. and then we can all talk to each other. But Jasmine, in your piece, you shared about your experience of sitting with your aunts and uncles who were in the deaf community, and your experiences of finding yourself in the margins last center again following your own disability diagnosis. Can you talk about how these experiences shape each other and shape how you understand yourself or understand um, your aunts and uncles in a different way?
Sure. Um, so I feel very lucky, blessed, fortunate that I grew up surrounded by so many people with different disabilities. My mom was a language interpreter for most of my life, and so I grew up in the middle of this deaf community, and we sat together in church, and my dad was working shifts, and my mom was at the front interpreting. So I sat with the people she put me with, which were all the deaf people, and um, I didn't think anything of it. I didn't, as a child, realize that I had more disability connections than the average person. That was just my world. And my mom went on to work in the school system with kids with varying disabilities. And I remember she was teaching sign language to a young girl who wasn't deaf, but didn't use words to communicate. And so her parents thought maybe sign would help. And so she used to come to our house and just hang out with us to practice using sign in an everyday situation. And she and I ended up becoming friends later in elementary school because they integrated her into our school. So I've just had so many people around me my whole life that had disability, that when I got my diagnosis, and first I'm thinking chronic illness. That was kind of how I identified, and that's not new to me. I've had diabetes for 21 years. I live as a person with chronic illness, so that was the way I thought of it initially. But as my mobility started to deteriorate, and I needed to use mobility aids to walk, so I got a cane. And at first, I was a little shy about using it in public. But when I was able to flip the switch in my head and stop thinking myself as just an ill person, but to think of myself as a disabled person, it was very easy to embrace all those mobility aids and to see the freedom that they brought to me, and the freedom that identity brought to me. As a disabled person, I became part of this community, and I could ask other disabled people for advice, and join different support groups online, and just a lot of the thinking of theology of disability from work really helped me to process my own transition into becoming a disabled person. And I found it very interesting at work, because for the first 10 years in my career, I was a non-disabled person working with disabled people or people with disabilities. And so there was always that aspect to our relationship. I was a professional and they were the service users, and I was providing a service. And that still is our relationship. I still am a professional in the field, and I'm still, providing service to the people who use our services. But I notice sometimes a bit of a shift in how they react to me and respond to me. When I show up at a community event, and, I remember going to accessibility day downtown at our city hall, and I'd invited one of the people that uses our service to come with me so that we could together learn about accessibility and speak to the city, me as a staff, him as a person who uses the service, both representing the agency. I showed up with my walker, and it was the first time he'd seen me with a walker. He uses a wheelchair, and I walked in, he was like, "You have wheels today," and he was just like so excited to see me with wheels and him with wheels. And then the next time I saw him, I didn't have my wheels, I had my cane, and he was commented again like, "Oh, where are your wheels today?" And that was like one example of how it has changed a lot of my relationships with the people that I work with. And it's just one more way that we understand each other. I think And they've been so gracious in how they just accept and embrace me. Um, I think I feel embraced in a different way than when I was a non-disabled staff person working with them. Them seeing me as having a disability, even though it's a different disability than what they have. Everybody has different diagnoses. There's a connection because we are all in this community together, right? I am now inside the margins of the group, and that means I'm in the center. And so there's just such a joy in being together. And that your piece, Jasper, where you talked about suffering. What did you say? You said embracing suffering while also summoning reservoirs of power within to transform one's worldview and potentially the world around oneself. Like, I feel like that's what I've experienced, embracing the suffering, because there was a lot of pain and, you know, medical trauma and stuff at the beginning of my illness. But embracing that suffering and summoning reservoirs of power within. And I believe those reservoirs of power within, for me, have come from my faith and my connection with God, with Christ, but also from my all those, you know, deaf aunts and uncles from church as a child, and different family friends who have had disability. um, that's that power within. What I've learned from them and internalized has really helped me to change my worldview. But it also, with my worldview changing, it shapes my world around me and my connection with other people. So I love that quote from your paper, and I wrote it down.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so much as Jasmine. In my work, I've been playing with this idea of coming out quick, like coming out queer, coming out mad, and and I think even though I was born with CP, I've only come out quick now that I'm doing this PhD work. So there's something about um, either being born with a disability or acquiring it, as with madness and queerness, that there's um power in coming out and then finding community um with other queer and queers and mad people. So grateful. I'm grateful for you both in this community. I wondered, we have a bit of time and Jasmine started us off, but just giving some more time for you to talk to each other about each other's work. Um, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I would love to speak a bit on your piece, Jasmine, if that's okay. I thought it was so beautiful and it resonated with me a lot, and I took so much away from it. Um, this idea of shifting the margins and being at the center, and the image of being surrounded by all these wonderful disabled role models. It brought me so much joy, and I think it really captured the idea of what community means, being at that heart and being held like that. Um, and, you know, like we were just saying, I think having that identity really helps to connect with community. Um, and having that language and claiming that, you know, self-identifying, especially as, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but, you know, somebody who has the experience of having labels forced upon me, um, it's very disempowering. So finding a community and identity can be such an empowering thing. And kind of emerging from these shadows of shame that society puts on us and tries to erase us, and saying, no, I'm proud of being this. I'm like, we are here, we're together, and we're a community. And that's totally the sense I got from your piece, Jasmine. The gift of this mutuality of community relationships, and the piece about being guest and host. I had never thought about it in that way. I loved that you described Jesus sitting with people where they're at and playing this role of guest and host. And I think that really captures the reciprocal nature of community care. I thought your piece was so full of gifts. Like you say, the gift of presence and difference, how the lives of people with disabilities is a gift. And I just felt like I was receiving this gift with your words. It was so joyful, and I really appreciated it. So thank you.
Thank you for the kind words. The article that I used a lot for inspiration writing mine was John Swinton. He wrote a piece on, now I'm blanking on the name and I should know because it's in there, but it actually was writing about how do we care for people with mental health difficulties. And then I kind of took that and applied it to disability, but it makes sense that it would resonate with you as you identify as MAD and as having mental health challenges, that it would that was his inspiration. That's what he was writing about, is how can the church care for people with mental illness. And it is about meeting them where they're at, sitting with them as they are, not requiring them to change, not requiring them to come into a different space, but to shift the margins. And that guest and host, that was a new concept for me, and I loved that idea. And as soon as I read it, I was like, yes, that's what the people that I'm connecting with on these Zoom meetings, the people from work that I've always thought of myself as kind of the host, it was flipping, and I felt that. But I liked in your piece, Jasper, where you talked about time. You talked about straight time that's linear, and you connected that to abstract hope, which was kind of this utopian daydreaming, and you contrasted that to like the fairies, who are nonlinear and they tie things up in knots. And you talked about concrete hope, which is embracing the suffering. It's not this like abstract daydreaming hope, but it's like concrete, like we know what the hard things are, so then how can we embrace that, move through it, summon that power within to hope for something real. And I thought that connected well with the idea of Crip time, which, Miriam, I know you've written about Crip time, and it's so true. Crip time is non-linear, right? How many times do we as disabled people do a thing only to have to undo and redo the thing because it didn't work right, or our bodies didn't cooperate, or the systems outside didn't allow us to do it in a linear fashion? We have to jump through a million hoops or doctor's appointments. So Crip time is all tied up in knots, and it's a different way of living. But then that concrete hope, right, of having been through the suffering, and and then having a hope for something that's real and more tangible than just we see that now a bit. People are like, well, when COVID's all over, and some people are like, well, when COVID's over, and I'm like, you're not a person with chronic illness and vulnerabilities. You are not meaning that the same way that somebody who has vulnerabilities is thinking. Like, COVID is not just going to magically be over. It's going to be a long, tangled up, knotty process to figure out how are we all going to be safe together in community. And I see that difference between this, linear, abstract hope, straight time, and then this like tangled up in knots, but a concrete hope, because it will be better at some point. It's not going to be this always. We'll move on to whatever the next stage is. Hopefully it's better.
Yeah, so well said. Absolutely.
It was funny going into reading yours. I didn't know how much overlap we'd find. I read the title and I was like, well, this seems very different. I don't know how much connection, but then when I read it, I was like, there's actually more connection than I expected here. And I felt like I could relate to a lot of what you're talking about being part of the queer community, or the MAD community, and how that related to being part of the disabled community. So thank you.
Totally. No, thank you. I think it was chosen very well. There were definitely overlaps. Yeah.
It's been so great to listen to both of you talk, and it's so fun as editors, for Miriam and I, where we know both of you in a certain way, and then to hear you come together and talk has just been so great. We just have one last question that we wanted to linger on before we end our time today, and I wanted to actually sort of hone in on the last part of the question, which is, so both of you are doing work that is difficult at times with communities that are, have been hurt. Or in our last podcast earlier today, one of our participants was talking about the structural violence that people experience who are from the LGBTQ community or the disabled and MAD communities. So that's sort of resting on me now as we're talking still. And I just wonder if you both could share a little bit about your own self-care. What are the things that you do to keep yourself healthy and running and not going under when we're faced with a lot of pain and a lot of suffering in the people that we work with or that we talk to, our friends, our family members? Would you be able to say a little bit about your self-care? Jasper, can I invite you to go first?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
So for me, my answer to that is always art. It always comes back to art. Art is always there to hold me. It's something that I always have access to. And art in the sense of everything creative, like that creative force. So whether it's visual art or poetry, listening to music, watching movies, it's just there's always art and stories to hold me. And especially, I think, witnessing art that kind of reflects my own challenges and my own lived experiences in community is especially hopeful for me, and very nourishing. Even like conversations like this, Jasmine, reading your piece, I find that's such a deep form of self-care for me, connecting with community through art. And also lots of sleep. Lots of sleep as much as possible. So I think those would probably be my top forms of self-care at the moment.
For me, I would say medication. Like, honestly, just remembering to take my meds. I have to take meds every 2 hours, and if I forget, I start to wear down. So just those things, just paying attention to my body and actually doing those things, and using my other like medical interventions that I have is something I easily forget when I get overwhelmed. Um, but then when I do it, I'm like, oh yes. So that's important. But on more like spiritual level, engaging with spiritual practices. So participating in my church, I've been able to be a lot more involved since COVID because everything's so accessible. Like, I really struggled with the mobility aspects of participating fully at church, and they're gone now. So that's been lovely. And then making things tangible, getting out of my head, because I find it's very easy to get caught in the anxiety, especially when you're doom scrolling at 2 a.m. on, Facebook and all the social media. It's like, so getting out of my head, out of the screens, and something tangible. So lighting a candle, and saying a prayer and inviting the Holy Spirit into the home with the light of the candle is helpful. Using a rosary or prayer beads, or even with just my fingers to guide my prayers, is a way to like keep my mind focused and to embody it. And then I'm with you, Jasper. Art, making things. I don't do art the way you do, but I knit like obsessively, and so that's been helpful. And just putting down the screen and then doing something concrete with my hands, making something beautiful, functional, and even better if I can gift it to somebody else, because then I'm focusing on another person's needs or personality instead of my own anxiety, and it gets me out of my head and into my body and into a relational space instead of a spiraling space.
Wow. I love this conversation. I love the knitting and the playing and the art and the medication and the time, time, taking that quick time, for time to live in a different way than society or than so many people around us. So Amy and I want to thank you so much again for your work, for your time today, for your and also for your engagement in this work of disability justice, mental health, wellness, justice, in all the ways that intersects with so many communities. And we're just very grateful for you and hope you can be in future editions again. Amy, am I missing anything?
I don't think so. And I apologize. Someone is mowing the lawn right outside my window, so you might hear some of that. Um, I don't think so. I just
We enjoyed seeing your kitty. I
oh
enjoyed seeing your
oh that's
kitty.
my younger kitty Amber. She gets bored and she likes to she whenever I am teaching a class, she always comes and hangs out. As you can see, she just can't. She loves the camera. um, I just wanted to, like Miriam said, express my gratitude to both of you for coming today to talk to us, and we hope that this podcast will be able to bridge some gaps between um, academia can get into its silos at times, and we hope that both this podcast and our journal can help to bridge some of those spaces between kind of like real life and academia, what the church is doing, what other faith communities are doing, and also activism work, and also part of the reason why we wanted to start this journal was to give space for different kinds of voices to be able to speak. So we're so thankful that both of you could come today and share with us. So yeah, I think we're good, Mir.
Yeah.